Well, welcome everybody to our second Zoom workshop. Some of you may have joined us from the previous one. Some of you are coming now for the first time. So welcome to everyone. We really try to start on time so we can use the 1 hour allocated to this workshop. I'm very pleased to have with us today Leo Baunach, who is the director in the Washington office of the International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC, and the Global Unions. And I hope you have followed Leo's video lecture in the online course, and here we'll have an opportunity to engage with Leo on question of reforming the international financial institutions. And I think it kind of dives in very nicely with the previous conversation we had when we were discussing the different policy options that were there for the government, and where the issue of capital control and the role of international financial institutions came in. So I'll not take more time. I'll just give the floor to Leo for a couple of opening remarks, and then I will invite you to make questions. Please state your country and also go quickly to your question. And the same, if you just want to type your message, just say which country you're from and what's the question. Leo, over to you.
Great. Well, I'm very happy to be here with everyone and look forward to talking about the international financial institutions and the crisis, which is my bread and butter. The ITUC Global Union's office here in Washington is the focal point of the global labor movement for advocacy with the international financial institutions, which we see as, an enormously big influence on the policies and economic development of countries all over the world. Of course, often in the negative direction, but something that we absolutely need to be constantly monitoring and fighting to improve. I'll just kind of briefly say a couple of things that maybe were left out of the lecture. One is we can think of the current juncture as a long arc from the last crisis and compare and contrast a few elements of the response now. The last crisis, we see a multilateralism that was much more strong, much more reactive. The G20 was upgraded from a finance ministers meeting into a leaders meeting, and in London, really did lead a multi-pronged response to the crisis, of which a big part of it was the international financial institutions, getting them the resources and really, pushing to use the finance of developed countries to restore growth and jobs in developing countries. But that was done within a very orthodox framework, a very kind of status quo framework. So that money came attached with all the same conditionalities, often pushing, privatization, decreasing the size of the public sector. And of course, then we see very quickly, after an initial commitment to stimulus, we see a premature, very fast, and extremely aggressive and harsh turn to austerity in 2010, which the IMF was really instrumental in making happen. So that's one thing I think we need to be very attentive to. This time, it's already quite clear that they're going to push a return to austerity soon, and almost certainly too soon. So we need to try and prevent that. It's a big task unto itself. But then that reaction, sort of lays the seeds of what we see now. So because there was such a disastrous, effect on many people around the world in the response programs to the global financial crisis, it eroded trust in multilateralism. It helped some of the right-wing nationalist governments that are in power now come into power in places like Hungary. It was Viktor Orban has been very, clear that he's a right-wing populist against the dictates of the IMF and the World Bank. So that failed response, which extends into things like more precarious employment because there was weakening of labor market regulations or the prevention of measures to strengthen working conditions, and collective bargaining where they're not currently strong or weren't strong before 2010. All of that lays the groundwork for the current crisis. So in a way, they're shooting themselves in the foot because they've undermined multilateralism so much. There's now an inability to come together around even basic agreements. The G20 was asked in March by the IMF and the World Bank to do some sort of debt relief on an emergency basis, and it took them more than 3 weeks to come to an agreement. So there's just not a willingness to act, and indeed we haven't seen fundamental reform of the way the institutions operate either. So I don't want to, sugarcoat it that we should just fight for more resources. Of course not, but we need more resources. We need to change how those resources are delivered. But at the root of that is the fact that we have governments and peoples that lack trust, massive erosion of social cohesion and social contracts that make it very difficult to do any form of action, much less the kind of fundamental reform of the international financial institutions that we need to have, which is really to overturn the kind of market fundamentalism dominating their operations. I'll put in the chat a couple of papers we recently put out on the IMF and the World Bank and how market fundamentalism manifests at those institutions today, particularly in the last 10 years since the global financial crisis. And I left most of the debt issues out of the video since Christophe, I think, covered that quite nicely globally. But just to say where we're at in terms of the international financial institutions and debt is they've been very vocal as advocates of debt relief by others. They came out again, before the G20 and asking them to do bilateral creditor debt relief. So, like a country like Germany will agree to a standstill on debt. And there's still, where the World Bank in the last couple of days has called on private creditors to participate in that standstill, which unfortunately they're not really doing. But there's been very limited actions in terms of money owed to the international financial institutions, which for low-income countries is 30, 40, even 50% of their external debt. So it's really significant. The IMF has done limited debt relief. 25 countries saw their payments canceled for 6 months. That's good. It's very good. It goes beyond what the G20 countries are doing. G20 countries are doing a moratorium on payments, but you still have to pay them later. That IMF, at least for 6 months, those payments never have to be paid. But it's only 25 countries. It doesn't include many low-income and lower middle-income countries. And really, the biggest challenge now is the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks, the African Development Bank and so forth, are refusing to do anything similar, either a standstill or cancellation of debt. They say it's because they're afraid of being downgraded by the credit rating agencies, which are a huge factor all over this discussion, and because they want new resources. If they're going to do debt cancellation, that would be money coming into them by repayments. They want it to be replaced by donor governments. And as I noted in the video, donor governments are very anemic to new contributions right now. So that's, I think, one of the key deliverable things that we can fight for in the short term is debt relief on money owed to the multilateral development banks, hopefully on the road to a real international process on sovereign debt restructuring and relief, which is clearly necessary. So I will leave it there. I look forward to talking more with people.
Thank you very much, Leo. Do I have any question? Somebody wants to take the floor? If so, please state where you're from and your question.
Hi, can I come in?
Please do.
Hi, everyone. My name is Luisa Guerra. I am Brazilian, but I am currently living in Switzerland. I am working at the ILO in the partnerships department, specifically with South-South cooperation. And I have worked before as well in the African Development Bank briefly. And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned just now the regional development banks, and I wanted to ask you more on that. So what role do you see to this kind of regional initiatives, or even to South-South cooperation, or this kind of organizations between countries of the South, and what role this kind of organizations and initiatives can have into trying to change a bit this the paradigm of the international financial institutions?
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a great question. one thing I'll point to that I think is really interesting and is perhaps a model for other development banks is the Asian Development Bank's what they call the Countercyclical Support Facility. This is something they created after the global financial crisis, and it's a big pot of general budget support money that governments can access to do stimulus programs, and it comes with it doesn't have harsh conditionality, and it's not as tailored as loan programs, so governments have a lot more control over how it's used. The attached requirements are basically you have to be doing a stimulus program that's inclusive, that will help the poor the most, and you have to have, the only thing I would say is a problem with it is it does require the IMF to sign off on the macroeconomic framework of the country, which unfortunately still kind of binds some countries that might try and challenge the IMF's dictates to not access that money. But in general, it's just, it's money that governments can use to do stimulus, which, all the other banks certainly have a role to play in stimulus when they fund projects, when they give, loans for specific purposes. But I think the ADB's model is really interesting. It's explicitly budgetarily supporting stimulus measures. I think that's a model that others can adopt, and it was in place. It was able to be rolled out immediately with COVID, with just a few little tweaks to eligibility to kind of account for more of a pandemic rather than financial or natural disaster situation. So that's a good thing. But South-South cooperation. The interesting thing here is I think that we can reflect now on kind of the really lack of change that's come out of the new international financial institutions that were created, at the initiative of emerging and developing countries, which, in 2015, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which, China is the largest shareholder of, and the New Development Bank, which is, the so-called BRICS Bank. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are the only board members. Both those institutions have largely modeled themselves. I think there was hope in the beginning that they would be different, but they've completely modeled themselves after the existing institutions. So the New Development Bank is like the World Bank. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is very similar to the Asian Development Bank. It just has a narrower focus because it only lends in infrastructure. But they've hired staff, away from those institutions. They've hired a lot of people that retired from the World Bank and from other institutions. So they kind of just copied it. And so you now have, perhaps an institution that is led by developing countries and emerging economies, but the way it operates, the effect it has is not any different. So I think that's disappointing, but there is a real need for alternative models from the South to be developed. I just don't think that that's happened. And then on the kind of more IMF, monetary and financial side, there are these regional, global, safety nets, basically financial safety nets, things like the European Stability Mechanism and similar arrangements. I'm forgetting the names right now, I'm sorry. But in Asia and Latin America, Asia has the largest one. Some of that money you can only be accessed by countries that also have IMF programs. Some of it is unbounded, which I think is probably the best approach. So there's certainly a lot of room for kind of mutual, creating before a crisis strikes, systems of mutual aid and financial solidarity that are run, just within regions in the South to kind of help protect regional stability and create a bit more control that's outside of the IMF.
Thank you for that response, Leo. We have in line Christiane Booker. Christiane, if you can just introduce yourself, where you're from, and make your question to Leo. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Christiane Böcker. I'm actually living in Malawi and working in Malawi, but originally I'm from Germany. For me, the question is, can anything of this be reformed? I think we need a total new way to think about economics. We cannot always think about making debts and trying to grow and grow and grow in a world that has limits and where resources are limited. And I think we are at a point, perhaps never have we been there before, where it's perhaps possible to make fundamental changes to say, how do we we have to choose another model of economy. And I think those big players, these big banks, they don't have their role in this. Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think you maybe sound a bit more optimistic than I do about the prospects for, you know, replacing these institutions. I think that there's just so little appetite among governments right now for multilateral cooperation of any kind. That's a really constraining factor. So I view this as kind of, you know, for the labor movement, a two-way fight. You know, on the one hand, we have to fight against reactionary right-wing nationalism that doesn't believe in international cooperation of any kind. And we have to fight against, you know, kind of a neoliberal model of multilateral cooperation, which currently dominates the institutions and many of the governments that are somewhat more open to multilateralism. You know, we have to fight those on both ends, right? You know, we need a multilateralism that actually is based on solidarity, is based on shared prosperity, is based on reducing inequality, and should be based, yes, should be based on a different economic model. That's something we're trying to put on the table with, you know, the kind of arguing that the fundamental issue here is market fundamentalism guiding the IMF and the World Bank in the paper that I sent around. But you know, to be honest, the prospects for replacing it, even in a crisis of this scale, I think are limited, and we should be careful not to overestimate the opportunities presented by a systemic crisis of this kind, because we know that systemic crises, like the global financial crisis, are often actually more of an opportunity for the, you know, orthodoxy to reassert itself, which is certainly what we saw after the global financial crisis. I mean, it's shocking. Actually, if you look at the IMF, I mean, the IMF in 2005 has very little money. They're looking at staff cuts. They're not trusted by governments. Many governments see them as persona non grata after the Asian financial crisis, after Argentina default in 2001. But now, the global financial crisis, you know, massive capital infusion in the IMF, and now governments, you know, trust them or don't have a choice to work with them as much. So, you know, crises can really re-entrench some of these systems. And I think that that's just avoiding that from happening is a fight. But yeah, I mean, our ultimate goal should be fundamental reform. If you want to call it replacement, call it replacement. You know, I think it's the same end goal for sure.
We have the hand raised from Gerikanai Shoko. Over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Gerikanai Shoko. I work for Building and Woodworkers International. I'm based here in South Africa. Let me start by saying IMF and World Bank they should ensure that financial coordination of a global recovery that limits the influence of private capital, allows for needed social spending, and restructures global debt across low and income countries in a manner that encourages the attainment of Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. But there has been calls, I think, over the past years, even before the COVID-19, that these institutions must be reformed. Do you think IMF and World Bank are ready to reform? That is my question.
Great, thanks. And you brought up a lot of really important issues on the Sustainable Development Goals and pushing for greater alignment there, which I think is a real tool that we can use to you know, try and push for reform, to try and change the operations and effects of the international financial institutions. That's a real platform if we take advantage of it, and that's something that I think the labor movement has been trying to do since 2015. And I'll mention a couple, you know, of other things. One is, you know, outside more broadly, the international financial institutions, I2C is pushing for a global fund for universal social protection that would be, you know, not controlled by the IFIs, but would be a big pot of money from advanced economies that provide low-income countries with the resources to immediately put in place social protection floors consistent with ILO recommendation 202. And then, there gradually that money would be replaced by domestic revenue mobilization, like progressive taxation, the kind of thing South Africa is talking about in terms of wealth and income taxes, and really international corporate tax reform, which is the hugest thing we're grappling with here. And international corporate tax reform, involves very much challenging and limiting and regulating the power of private finance. Indeed, I think other folks have talked about capital controls in the chapter, which I think are a very big tool here, and somewhere where the IMF in the last decade has softened its stance on capital controls. It's not nearly enough, but we have actually made progress on where before they would say absolutely no capital controls under any circumstances. They now, when governments propose it and do it, are much more willing to accept those decisions. But certainly within a limited window, it's something to keep pushing on capital controls with them as well. But to your question, are they ready to change? No. Are they ever going to be ready to change? Probably not. We need to force them to, and that means we need to push our governments to reform these institutions, because these institutions are at the end of the day intergovernmental institutions. So if we could win over governments to intervene, it's that's the path to victory, I think. But unfortunately, they are dominated by a handful of major economies: the U.S., Japan, and Europe. Underrepresentation of the developing and emerging economies, how these institutions were created. It's part of why they're so unfair. So achieving that, the entire African continent in terms of governments are united on the need for much bigger international action on debt, because they are facing the front lines of those issues. But, we've seen very little progress because the traditional powers are, kind of refusing to take action. So unfortunately, I think that even if we can build a kind of coalition like in the 1970s, the new international economic order push from a number of developing countries at that time, many of them recently decolonized, which ultimately kind of failed. Even if you can do that, right? That has been tried before. It's an enormously powerful experience we can draw on and look back to, but it failed, and so we really have to fight in the advanced economies. And that's where I think a labor movement based on international solidarity is really powerful, when we can have workers' movements in, places like France and places like the United States and Canada fighting for changes to the institutions as well. But yeah, any institution has its entrenched beliefs and will fight reform, but I think it can be changed, right? These institutions haven't always been like this, and they don't have to be like this. Prior to the 1980s, the kind of loan conditionality and harsh, policy measures based on market fundamentalism were not the norm. That was something that was done intentionally, led by the United States, the Reagan administration, to really change how these institutions operate, and that's how we got structural adjustment policies. So if that can be changed, and we can build up enough counter power here, then we can change those institutions into something else. But I don't think it'll be easy. I don't think it'll be fast by any means.
Let me see, there is a question from Christiane again. I suppose I should read it because she doesn't want to say it. So the measures that were prescribed by the institutions have failed. Research clearly shows that, at least in the health sector and social sector, is that evidence not a weapon to push for change?
Oh, absolutely. And I think many are trying. There's a particularly good report by ActionAid from last month that looks at the policy advice of the IMF on what they call public wage bills, which is basically how much does a country spend total on the wages of public employees. And in most countries, of course, that's teachers and that's public hospital workers. So, they made a very good, effective way of kind of presenting, that pressure in countries as part of the vulnerability here. That's why, in large part, why many countries don't have enough nurses, enough doctors, enough ventilators in public hospitals, Meanwhile, the World Bank, pushing kind of public-private partnerships in healthcare is another issue that creates, maybe there are enough ventilators, but they're in private hospitals that not everyone has access to. So yeah, these are huge issues, and I think an opportunity to really push on, particularly on the public sector employment viewpoints of these institutions. There was a big push on that in the early 2000s after structural adjustment. And so, for example, there were wins at the IMF where they said, okay, because the IMF used to say, this is the ceiling. You cannot spend, if you're going to continue to receive financial support from the IMF, you cannot spend more than X amount on your public wage bill, on public sector employment. They got rid of that. That's an explicit policy change. So I was sitting with someone from the IMF last year and said, we don't do public wage bill ceilings anymore. We advise countries to limit the growth of the public wage bill. So ultimately it's the same. I mean, they're not attaching a hard number that you hit, but they're absolutely pressuring countries to drop this down. In Tunisia, there was a loan disbursement that the IMF withheld for several months because the Tunisian unions had negotiated wage increases in the public sector. Tunisia is a great example on this, by the way. In Tunisia also, there's been an enormous amount of pressure on the government from the IMF and actually from the World Bank too. You're spending too much on public sector employment. Part of the reason for that is, prior to the revolution in 2011, a lot of workers in things like public hospitals were subcontracted. So there was a line item on your budget that said, this is how much we pay public sector hospital workers. And there was another line item that said, this is how much we pay subcontractors. Now, all those subcontractors did were hire workers to be in the hospital, take a cut, and then pay them a lower wage. Most of those people were brought in-house after the revolution, and really participation of the trade unions in the transition process after the overthrow of Ben Ali. So that made it look like there had been this huge growth in the public sector wage bill. In fact, you were spending less money because you don't have a bunch of subcontractors taking a cut anymore. And another move that was very misleading, they attacked Tunisia for spending too much on teachers, on education, because they compared it to Egypt and other countries that were spending less. And to reach the SDGs, you are going to have to spend more on health. You are going to have to spend more on education. Everyone agrees that's a good thing in general, but when you actually get down to the nitty gritty, you have the IMF and the World Bank undermining these things. And then the second part of that is they weren't actually spending that much more. It's because all teachers in Tunisia are paid out of the federal budget, whereas in Egypt, many of them are paid out of municipal budget. So it just shows up differently. These are just accounting issues that the IMF is, I think, willfully ignored in those cases, or sort of misleadingly presented in order to pressure the government to cut those. So yeah, that's a lot of evidence. These fights have been going on for a long time. There's, I can grab you the link for the Action Aid report and another report that was done a few years ago on the kind of long-term damage done by the IMF to the health sectors in West Africa, going back to structural adjustment. Let me find that. But yes, I mean, it is, but you are always going to run into the institution saying, I'm sorry, the reality is you have to cut the budget, and we need to present real alternatives that we can raise more money. We can tax corporations and the rich more. This is not the, there is no alternative, right? This is the constant thing we always get. So we still have to fight against that. But yeah, this is the time to push on this, absolutely.
We have a request if you could share the Action Aid study that you mentioned to everybody here. Then Gariganai just comments that he agrees with your explanation, but he thinks it's not easy for these institutions to reform. And perhaps just linking up to the video lecture where you had like this formal and informal arrangements which give power to the North, does that mean, Leo, that unless we have a change in the policies of these countries, we won't expect, and I mean the countries in the North that have the governance prerogative of these institutions, we won't see any change? And then there are a couple of other questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a marginal amount of change we can make by trying to kind of push, no double standard, right? I mean, many advanced economies have significant protections for workers, you know? So, you know, Netherlands, for example, which was one of the kind of key voices, unfortunately, in the IMF's attacks on Greece and saying that it was Greece's fault. They were in a financial crisis and so forth, when in fact it was much more based on international conditions. You know, those countries, the Netherlands has a centralized collective bargaining system. It has extensive protections for workers. So there's an extent to which, you know, some of these countries kind of want to apply very harsh policies through the international financial institutions on developing countries that they themselves do not practice at home. So we can push them to kind of at least, you know, do the same. But nonetheless, you know, we also have to kind of, I think it can be the same fight, right? It's the same fight to get protections for workers and raise wages in developing countries and as developed countries through and outside of the international financial institutions. And indeed, those fights are not, you know, contradictory. We should get beyond thinking that, you know, raising wages in one place is a detriment to workers in others, and this kind of downward competition on wages, and really, you know, fight for a global economic model, you know, change the rules of global economy so that we can't do arbitrage and competition, you know, on wages, for example, is really powerful as a goal. Did I miss a question there?
So we have a couple of questions, actually, a few people lined up. Luisa wants to to have another question, but Luisa, if I may, before that, perhaps have one of the participants that hasn't spoken yet. So we have a message from Jose Salas. I don't know where he's from, and there's no indication, but he's basically asking, what do you think about the Bill Gates Foundation effort to provide vaccines to COVID-19 as support of WHO with many contributions? Okay, so I think the question is somehow left. Oh, with more contributions than many other countries to get them.
I have to confess I don't know very much about it. I'd be happy to hear more about it and the relation to kind of international finance if that's something you're interested in talking about. But I will say, in general, we do have to figure out when a vaccine is available, how do we ensure equitable provision of it to people in developing countries. I think that's a huge question. There should be a role for the international financial institutions in making sure that people are able to get access and countries are able to get access to it. But I think that's also an issue of how do we set up vaccine? You know, if vaccine gets developed by a private lab, are they going to be able to profit off it? And if so, how? And what restrictions will that place on access? How will manufacturing, sharing of information on, you know, how do you manufacture this vaccine? Do you need samples? You know, that's a huge issue for international cooperation that I think has a very strong financial element, which is, you know, how do you pay for all this? That's a huge question. I know a little bit more about, you know, the World Bank supports Gavi, which is kind of the public-private partnership on some of the development of vaccines. I think, you know, Bill Gates is involved in that as well, you know, at least the Bill Gates Foundation. But I have to confess this isn't exactly my area, but I'm happy to hear more.
Okay, so Jose was from Lima, Peru, so we got that clear. Meanwhile, there is a comment on this topic from Cristiane saying philanthropic capitalists should better pay taxes instead of making more money with vaccines. Perhaps a contribution to this conversation, but I would give now the floor to Luisa, and then after that I have Ifenai raising her hand.
Okay, thanks again for the opportunity to ask a question. It's been very interesting. Thank you so much for this webinar. And yeah, you have mentioned before that clearly that the change is not going to come from within the international financial institutions. And this is something that you touched upon throughout the webinar, but I wanted to ask you more directly, what kind of instruments, I mean, you mentioned the SDGs, and what actors and what partnerships do you see as the way forward? You know, what kind of strategies as the way forward to promote this kind of change that we need to see so desperately? Thank you.
Great. Yeah. I mean, one thing I haven't touched on is fighting for real social dialogue at these institutions. There's very few examples of this, but one that is really strong and initially gave a lot of people some hope after the global financial crisis, but then that crashed on the rocks of Portugal and Greece and so forth. But in the IMF loan program in Iceland, because Iceland is 90+% union density, the very strong labor movement, the unions were really at the table when the program was being developed. They developed a loan program that did not, unlike Greece and elsewhere, did not bail out private banks after the global financial crisis, but did real effective things to help people and help the real economy, actual productive sectors in Iceland rebound. But that's never really been replicated elsewhere. But I think it's a great model. We need workers to be at the table. We need tripartite structures that we can kind of negotiate and have real dialogue. Right now, the model of the institutions is consultation, which is you'll have a polite meeting with the trade unions where they'll present to you what they think, and they'll present themselves. IMF and World Bank staff will. I hope I'm not being too malignant here, but present themselves as the smartest people in the world who know exactly what's going on, and anyone who questions them is incorrect. And they'll just kind of present what they think, and they might listen to trade union comments, but it's in one ear out the other. They rely very heavily on saying our role as an institution is to deal with governments, not to deal with stakeholders when pushed further. But I think building real methods of tripartite participation, as the ILO shows how that can happen. And I think there's a role for the ILO and being more active alongside workers and pushing for alignment of the international financial institutions with both, the international labor standards of the ILO and the Sustainable Development Goals, especially Goal 8 on decent work and full quality employment. That's really important too. So I think that's a great platform. But ultimately, there is this issue of they can always rebuff things as being normative. So they're very, so many people, and I think that's a worthwhile fight. I don't mean to say that it's not where we should concentrate our energy, but many people push for, okay, we need to inject human rights. We need to force the international financial institutions to obey human rights principles. I think that's really important, but I think those institutions have so far proven to be basically impervious to a lot of those demands. So we need to, develop economic arguments. We need to show why using capital controls, using stronger labor market regulation, centralized collective bargaining institutions, industrial policy, those have historically led and can be proven through, in economic studies to lead to development, to lead to stronger growth. I mean, some of that has even infiltrated the IMF kind of through its research department. I mean, they put out, people may have kind of heard of this in the last few years. The IMF's research department has put out a lot of research that shows that high levels of inequality actually impede economic growth. Part of the reason for it, they did other studies that part of the reason for inequality was because of the weakening of collective bargaining and trade unions in the last 30 years. Those have just not translated into changes in the operations of the institutions in an adequate way. So that's been a forefront of our fight, I think, has been aligning actual research. What's the real evidence we see in the world with what do the institutions do? So, there's IMF researchers last year that put out a paper that, showed what many of us know in the labor movement, which is that countries that have successfully developed have done it through industrial policy. Not through opening your borders and attracting a bunch of low-wage manufacturing that leaves, doesn't pay any taxes and exploits workers. So I think bridging that evidence is really important from I think we need to have that economic. We can fight for our rights and our standards here, but we also need to really fight on their terrain, which is the terrain of economic arguments. And because unfortunately they like to play that trump card of saying, well, human rights are good and everything, but ultimately, economics means we have to make these choices. Economics says we have to have this set of policy prescriptions, and that's absolutely untrue. So I think we need to really hone and develop those arguments, both to the institutions and then especially to our governments. We need to governments need to be able to challenge these institutions behind closed doors when they're negotiating a loan program, when a donor country is negotiating giving more money. Our governments need to be able to understand those arguments that they can put to the leadership of these institutions. Because of course, we can draw somewhat of a line between the institution and the government. You know, the governments ultimately control the institution, but these are long-standing institutions that develop their own culture and their staff and all that. So, you know, attacking on both ends is super important.
There are lots of discussions in the chat group here, but I would first give the floor to Ifenai because she's also she is a new speaker. So over to you, Ifenai, and please say where you're from. Okay, until Ifenai takes the floor, I don't know what's happened. So the hand is up, but it's not showing up. Okay, so there is a specific question, Leo, from Christiana saying, in the course material, you share a report from the UNWHR, is that UNCWHR, on human rights consequences of conditionalities. Can there be a complaint against IMF and World Bank?
Maybe. I will leave that to the lawyers perhaps, but that was a very strong, well, if I'm thinking of the same one, I think this is the report by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Effects of Foreign Debt, which when Juan Pablo Bohoslavsky was the mandate holder there on the kind of, you know, economic effects and labor rights effects of adjustment programs. Which is very strong, built on an enormous amount of evidence. And he went on from that report to also develop guiding principles on human rights impact assessments. So the arguments that IFIs should, you know, do human rights impact assessments, including labor rights, but also, you know, gender issues, all sorts of things before the program and after the program. I think that that's something really strong and concrete that we can push for, because these institutions these days are saying they care about these issues. They're saying they care about inequality. They're saying they care about gender, but they twist those to mean other things. So the World Bank will tell a country, in order to allow more women to enter the labor force, you need to weaken employment contracts, and so make it more possible to have more fixed term contracts, more temporary work contracts, because that will enable more supposedly more gender equality rather than what actually happened, which is women in particular get you know, slotted into precarious work contracts. So we need to fight also, I think, on the interpretation of some of these things. Yeah, that's another issue. But I mean, a complaint, I'm not sure exactly how, but always an interesting idea. And then I just wanted to kind of touch back to one of the other comments was from Shoko. IFIs should engage different stakeholders, including trade unions, to ensure that the social benefits of financing infrastructure projects provide decent work and social protection to the workers. This, I will say, is actually somewhere where we have, as the labor movement internationally, made a lot of progress. I think the big fights I've mostly been talking about today have been policy advice, IMF, loan conditions, but where we have made real change is the labor standards on projects funded by the international financial institutions. So putting aside the IMF, but all the multilateral development banks, most of them, the World Bank, European Investment Bank, African Development Bank, have binding labor standards on their projects about how workers who implement those projects are treated. So those are infrastructure workers building a hydropower dam or building a road, or those are hospital workers or teachers, you know, on projects funded by the World Bank in those sectors. That's really powerful. That's, you know, that's absolutely a tool for workers to organize, to claim their rights under, you know, these are pretty closely aligned, then not completely, but pretty closely aligned with the ILO core labor standards that protect freedom of association, occupational health and safety. So, and they're part of the loan agreements. You know, they're not just nice statements. This is, you know, the borrower is in violation of their loan if they violate workers' rights. So that's something where we made a lot of progress, and I hope that, you know, those of you that are in labor unions or work with labor unions, this is a real tool that we have to fight for better working conditions, and to, you know, push for more, ultimately push for more social dialogue, more attention to workers in the institutions more broadly. But I think we made a lot of progress in trying to improve the actual effects. You know, because there's billions of dollars that the World Bank loans in infrastructure projects every year, as you probably know. in Southern Africa is certainly a big area, and there's been a lot of wins on that. I know in East Africa, a number of unions have been able to form unions, organize on World Bank funded projects because of those labor standards.
And related to that, Leo, you may be seeing also the comment from Luisa that rather than more social dialogue, actually what we're seeing is the growing importance of these multi-stakeholder partnerships, which are in effect, just strengthen the role of the private sector operators. If you would have any comment on that.
Yeah, I mean that's of course a problem not just with the international financial institutions, but everywhere. You know, we saw multi-stakeholder initiatives kind of come out of pressure for labor rights in global supply chains like garments or electronics. You know, this is a very easy way to try and blunt some of that effect and to kind of I mean, I think there's another thing, which is many people, especially in the international financial institutions, don't know what social dialogue is. So in their mind, when they hear social dialogue, it's a concept which is indistinguishable from multi-stakeholder initiatives. You know, they don't understand, I think at a basic level, social dialogue involves decision making. It involves you actually, have real power in that body where you negotiate something on a tripartite or whatever basis that might be. It's not just sitting around and being consulted, which is sort of what multi-stakeholder initiatives are. And I think there's a bigger problem as well when you talk about the international financial institutions, which is promoting, the role of the private sector in everything. So they're pushing for more private sector involvement in healthcare and education. I read a publication a few months ago on. I want to say Burkina Faso, and I've heard the same thing in Tanzania with the World Bank, where they're telling the government, you should create more space for the private sector to influence policy. You should have more spaces for private companies to advise the government. And they of course will not say anything about social dialogue. They will not say anything about trade unions. So they're actually promoting, roles for the private sector in policy. And in many ways, the World Bank in particular has really, to be honest, I think the Sustainable Development Goals got hijacked, to be really blunt. The World Bank and other international financial institutions created a narrative that to achieve the SDGs, we need to spend trillions of dollars. We only have billions of dollars available in public finance and multilateral resources. The gap has to be bridged by the private sector, which then means, they then converted into, okay, that means we have to do everything we can to make private investors happy. You have to reform the laws of your country on how procurement and contracting is done, how labor standards are, how investment and taxes to attract private investment. So we're back to the same thing we got before the SDGs. And that was unfortunately a very effective way that they kind of twisted the financing for development discussion, the discussion of how we finance the SDGs. So that's, I think, a broader issue that goes to the role of the private sector, arraying our policies around the private sector with decreasing space, for trade unions and for workers at the table. And also in the chat, I sent around our other publication. I'm sorry to bombard you with paper, but that's what I do, which is a trade union guide on using the labor standards of the multilateral development banks on things like infrastructure to fight for union rights, to fight for safe workplaces. It's a longer, in-depth publication, but if you look just in the early part, there's like a 2-page quick guide that'll give you kind of just the basics of what's in those labor standards, how you can use them. And so forth, and certainly our office is always available to help trade unions on doing that work, and indeed engaging with the international financial institutions.
Thanks very much again, Leo. I see the hand of Ifenai also raised again. So Ifenai, if you hear me, please go ahead with your question and where are you from?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Ifani Onyonoram. I'm participating from Nigeria. I observed that more than 2 decades of resisting neoliberalism, particularly in the third world, the multilateral financial institutions tend to be growing more influential in terms of, dictating socioeconomic policies in the third world and I'm a bit worried and afraid the way we can go, because I see that they deal more with the government, while the resistant movements deal more with institutions. Is there no possibility of change of strategy? And is there no possibility of alternative funding system that would, not be so dictatorial towards neoliberalism? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think what we need to understand is the unfortunately, often the symbiotic relationship between governments and international financial institutions. So it's very common that they will kind of share the burden of implementing neoliberal reforms that really hurt working folks. So the government will implement a policy and say, well, I had no choice but to raise value-added taxes instead of progressive taxes because that's what the World Bank told me to do. I don't want to. When in case that government official definitely did want to raise value-added taxes and needed cover, so the international financial institutions will provide cover to them, and likewise, one thing I think that I did refer to in the video is development policy lending. It used to be called structural adjustment lending, but that doesn't sound good, so they don't say that anymore. But it's money that the World Bank gives that's contingent upon a set of policy reforms that the World Bank and the government agreed to. But somewhat comically, if you talk to people at the World Bank, they'll say, no, we don't control that, because each loan has a set of prior actions. So loan conditions, in order to get the money, you have to do these reforms. Your parliament has to pass this reform on pensions, for example. And they'll say, well, the government comes up with those prior actions. We don't come up with them, which is also ludicrous. They absolutely do dictate prior conditions. They absolutely do push the government to do things like pension reform that's regressive. So, but they'll blame, they're very strategic about when they blame one and when they blame the other. So I think we need to, as much as we can, break up that relationship. But yeah, I mean, we should be smart about when we target the institution versus when we target the government, understanding, I think, that dynamic. Of course, alternate financial systems, but I certainly don't have a roadmap to how we get there. That's a big task.
Is there someone who would like to make any final question? We have about 6 minutes to end the session. So if anybody has got a burning question, please do make it now. And if not, Leo, I will just read you a final comment from Christian, perhaps, which you may also see, like the richest 1%. If they could only be taxed, we would have had enough money for the SDGs. So I leave it to you to perhaps wrap up the session and taking into consideration also this final point by Christian.
Yeah, I mean, that's a nice way to end, which is that, the policy dictates of the international financial institutions, although presented as to governments as the only way forward or as the best way forward, are absolutely not the only way forward. There are, corporate taxation, progressive taxation. There is enough money out there, right? We've had enormous growth of the financial sector. We've had enormous wealth be produced globally, especially through resource extraction and low-wage manufacturing and low-wage work in developing countries. So the money's out there. I think someone put this as a comment on the module on the website. So the money's out there. We need to figure out how to do equitable distribution, equitable redistribution, that's, we can present real policy alternatives. We can present real reforms that would achieve the SDGs, that would build a more fair global economy for everybody, especially working people. But that's the work, that's the task. And I think, I guess this class is on COVID, of course, which I guess I haven't talked too much about, and I'm sorry, but in the context of COVID, we are facing down, how are we going to recover? Are we going to have another recovery that's based on precarious work, that's based on continued power for the financial sector, and lack of regulation to protect workers, you know, what sort of world are we going to build? And it's I think a task for everybody, if, you know, to push for what kind of an economic approach is going to be taken, and how do we finance building back better from COVID, particularly building strong social protection, health, and labor systems that make us more resilient, that mean we don't get into a situation where people don't have access to healthcare, they don't have access to social protection if they lose their jobs or income, and they aren't, you know, already trapped in low wage, precarious work before a crisis even hits. So I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much, Leo. I think it was a very inspiring session, actually. I suppose the main takeaway is that we cannot just wait for the international financial institutions to just reform themselves. It seems that the terrain of struggle is still national. The cases from Iceland, for instance, shows that where unions are strong and able to pressure the government, they can even make these financial institutions actually to bow down. So the power is still with the people on the ground. I thank you very much for your time, and thanks everybody for the very interesting discussions, and looking forward to the next workshops. And if you have any question to Leo, please leave a comment under the videos in the workshop or write to him. You can contact him in the diversity platform. Thanks a lot, and have a great day there, Leo. And a good afternoon to people in the same time zone, and good night to people in Asia.
Indeed, thanks to the people in Asia for joining. That's I know how big of a lift that is.
Thank you very much,
Everyone,
Leon.
have a good day.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is very interesting.
Yes.
Thank you.